The U.S. Chamber of Commerce says that the American and Chinese economies are so deeply interconnected that they could be weaponized against each other in a market of 1.4 billion people. But there is still time to take back the U.S.'s control over its economy while simultaneously working with China. Zack Cooper is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Zack, nice to see you.
Great to see you, too.
There was just a virtual summit between Presidents Biden and Xi. Has the U.S. relationship with China improved?
Well, it's probably less bad than it was 3 or 4 months ago when the two sides were exchanging very pointed comments in public. But I think the reality is that we haven't really solved any of the structural issues within the relationship. So we've now had a somewhat more positive meeting between Biden and Xi on Monday night. But the reality is that the core problems in the relationship aren't going away anytime soon. So the temperature may have been turned down a bit, but I think in the long term, those tensions remain.
So I want to ask you about the supply chain issues. What's the root of that problem, and what is China's role in that?
As you know, so many of our supply chains go back not just to China, but all over the world and are deeply interconnected. And I think pre-pandemic, many of us just were used to those supply chains operating without too many problems. I think we've seen a number of cases, right, whether it's ships getting stuck in canals or pandemic-related issues, or now ports not having enough offload capacity, where actually the global supply chain is really struggling. And it's affecting American people day to day, whether it means you can't get kitchen appliances, it's hard to get furniture, and even microchips for cars, which means that it can be difficult to buy a new car right now. All of those issues are related to the global supply chains and whether those supply chains are functioning effectively. And at the moment, in many ways they are, but when you see the marginal problems, I think the American people are really feeling that in their pocketbook and also with the difficulty of getting specific products.
You know, most people would say that the U.S. should lessen its dependence on Chinese goods with what's called selective decoupling. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's nothing wrong with selective decoupling, in my view. I think it's totally fine to go ahead with some degree of selective decoupling in which we try and look at the supply chains that matter most to us and make sure that we have trusted partners who are getting those goods and products from. But at the end of the day, we also have to think about where we want to be coupled with China. In other words, are there ways that the United States can use China's own reliance on the US economy to give the United States leverage? And I'll give you just one quick example, which is that many of the cell phone makers in China have long used Google's Android operating system. That means the US has a tremendous amount of leverage over a fair number of Chinese tech companies. And that's the kind of thing that actually can be good from an American policymaking standpoint so that we have leverage just in the same way that the Chinese do over us.
Okay, so you're recommending a deeper recoupling in certain areas. Give us a little bit more information on that. What areas and how do we go about doing that?
That's right. So right now, the United States has spent much of the last few years trying to figure out where China is dependent on the United States and to actually cut off some of those ties. Right. So this has been penalizing Beijing for some of the bad actions that the Chinese government has been taking and some of the concerns the US has about unfair trading practices and other economic practices. The reality is, though, in the short term, that makes a lot of sense. In the long term, it decreases our leverage. And so we have to make sure that in the long term, we still have accumulated leverage that we can use to try and force China to change its behavior. And that means perhaps in some areas, even deeper coupling between the US economy and the Chinese economy. And so when I think about that, I think about in particular areas like some microchips. Obviously not the ones that would go into Chinese military applications, but perhaps ones that go into more commercial applications that are necessary for the Chinese economy, where we actually could maintain China's dependence on us and therefore maintain our leverage in the future.
And how do you go about implementing this more strategic recoupling? I mean, does this happen at the Treasury Department?
That's right. It would require the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the U.S. Trade Representative, the White House, all working together. And not just that, we'd have to work with our key foreign partners too, because at the end of the day, if the US tries to decouple from China, then China can just look to other sources. And so we actually have to make sure that we have a united plan with our key allies and partners. And so this is a very tough effort. And I'll just note one more thing, which is there might not be a lot of political support for this unless it's done very carefully, because it would be very easy for this kind of recoupling effort to look like the Biden team was sort of giving in to China and just being willing to trade more. So it would have to be a real effort by the administration to work with the Congress as well.
All right. Well, Zack, thanks so much for being on the program. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.